Hi everyone and welcome to my new video, the making of Rey's hero outfit from Star Wars Episode VIII, The Last Jedi. I first started working on this cosplay back in 2017, but then Cinderella's ball gown came along and I pressed pause on this cosplay for the time being. Fast forward a few years and I finally got going on this project again and decided to film my process for your viewing pleasure. So let's get started and enjoy. The main fabric was this grey and taupe canvas. Some medium weight fusible interfacing for the waistband, and an invisible zipper in the matching color to the main fabric. Her trousers took me some time until I got them right. After not one, not two, but 3 mock-ups, I ended up with a pattern I was satisfied with. As with literally every sewing project ever, the first step was to lay out the pattern pieces on the fabric and cut them out. Before I serged the waistband pieces, I cut out interfacing and fused it to the corresponding pieces. I also cut out a small strip of interfacing that I fused to where the zipper was going to go at center back. Next, I serged all raw edges before moving on to the actual construction. To start out, I pinned the darts of the knee pieces closed, marked the stitching lines with chalk and sewed along those markings. After pressing the darts upwards, I added some decorative top stitching. Then the upper front leg pieces were sewn together. After the seams were pressed open, it was time for a lot of top stitching. Cue the Jyn Erso West War flashbacks. Next, I pinned the knee piece to the upper front leg and sewed those pieces together. Clipping into the seam allowances along the curved seam helped them to lay flat once pressed and top stitched. Following that, the lower front leg was sewn to the knee piece. Clip, press, top stitch and repeat. Then both front leg pieces were pinned in place and then I sewed the center front seam closed. After clipping the seam allowance at the curve, I pressed the seam open. Before I could sew in the zipper, I had to do some prepping first. I sewed the inner and outer waistband pieces together at the top edge and stay-stitched the seam allowances down on the inner waistband. After giving everything a good press, the waistband was sewn to the top edges of front and back trouser pieces, with the seam allowances being pressed up into the waistband. Now, onto the zipper. First, I closed the center back, starting from the notch marking where the zipper was going to end. After basting the zipper in, so it can't go anywhere, it was time to sew. And just like that, we have a neatly installed zipper. Now I only needed to sew the upper and lower leg pieces together and add some top stitching for the back leg pieces to be finished. You know the drill. Clip, press, top stitch, repeat. Almost done now. The side and seat seams were closed next and the seam allowances pressed open. Then the waistband was folded to the inside, seam allowances turned under and stitched in the ditch. The open edge of the waistband at center back was sewn to the zipper band by hand. For the final step, the hem allowance was turned up and stitched. And with that, Rey's trousers were done. . The boots are the Rey high boots in brown by Pozu, who made all the shoes Rey wears over the course of the sequel trilogy. The only difference between these and the screen-used pair is the zipper that was added to the commercially available ones for ease of getting in and out. As you can see, mine are pretty well worn, as I wear them pretty much all the time during the fall. Onto probably the simplest part of this cosplay, next to the arm wraps. I used this off-white rayon jersey that I had originally bought for The Force Awakens Rey. No further notions were required, except for this pale grey buttonhole thread, which I used for the blanket stitching around the neckline. I used the pattern for my Resistance Rey shirt, without the yoke seam in the back and the color pieces. I started by cutting out all pattern pieces from the jersey twice, as I was going to be self-lining the shirt. Once front and back pieces were cut out, I pinned them right sides together, making sure the crossover section wrapped from left to right. Then I serged the shoulder and side seams together. I serged the armhole layers together as well, folded the seam allowances under, and sewed them in place by hand. In order to finish off the neckline, I sewed around the open raw edges with a blanket stitch. The hem was left raw, with the lining layer being slightly longer, as it seems to be the case with Rey's shirt in the movie. And with that, the undershirt was complete. This definitely was the one thing about this cosplay I've been scared to make. I got super lucky and was able to get a few yards of the screen-used Mood Putty Surface embroidered fabric back in 2017 before it sold out. Knowing that I wouldn't be able to order more in case I messed up while making the tunic is what made me afraid to cut into this fabric. At 5 mockups, this definitely clocks in as the garment I've made the most prototypes for so far. Which is why I was considerably less nervous when it was finally time to cut into the precious Mood fabric. I cut out all pieces from the fashion and lining fabrics. For the lining, I was able to use up the remnants of this brown cotton, which I used to make Jyn Erso's vest back in 2017. First, as always, I ran all the pieces through the serger. This helped immensely in keeping the Mood fabric from fraying too much and to make sure the embroidery didn't unravel. Then I started out by pinning and sewing the bodice front pieces together at center back. I repeated that with the lining. After pressing the seams flat, I pressed the seam allowances open. Before moving on to the next step, I sewed the facings together at center back as well. After a good press, I pinned the facing and bodice front along the neckline at center front, right sides together, and sewed across. The seam allowances were clipped, stay-stitched onto the facing, and pressed. Next, the bodice back piece of the fashion fabric was pinned to the front and sewn together. I repeated the step for the lining as well. The seam allowances were pressed down. Then I closed the side seams of fashion and lining layers separately. After that, I set the bodice aside for now. I started working on the skirt panels next. I folded up the side and hem edges of fashion and lining layers by 1 centimeter. The lining layers were placed on top of the fashion layer, wrong sides together. After pinning them in place, I secured the edges with whip stitches. This was a true test for my patience, as each panel took me about an hour to sew. So, about 4 hours later, lining and fashion fabric have been connected, and now it was time to attach the skirt panels to the bodice. I pinned the panels along the waistline of the fashion fabric only, making sure to line up the edges of the panels with the side seams and center back. Once the skirt panels were secured in place, the seam allowances were pressed upwards so they wouldn't be visible when stitching the lining down. But first I had to sew the lining to the bodice facing. I lined up all edges where the facing and lining layers met, pinning the lining to the rest of the bodice as I went so it wouldn't shift around, and stitched them together. Next, I folded the seam allowances of the armhole to the inside, sandwiching them with the lining, and whip stitched that closed. Then I smoothed the bodice lining out towards the waistline, folded the bottom edge under so the seam allowances were covered, and pinned everything in place. Then I whip stitched along the edges, securing the lining. Almost done! The only thing left to do was to sew snap buttons to the front as a closure, and then this daunting piece of the outfit was complete. For the tabbards, I chose this rayon silk blend that I used previously for Rey's The Force Awakens tabbards. Since I only needed about half of the fabric's original width for that costume, I've had the other half sitting in my stash before I realized I could use it for her The Last Jedi hero outfit. And this is what the fabric looked like in the beginning after tea-dyeing it for the Force Awakens costume. Since I had already dyed it grey back in 2017 when I first started working on this project, I obviously don't have any footage of that process. Before doing anything, I measured how long each of the 4 sections would have to be so they would match the length of Rey's tabbards. I did that while wearing all of the costume's layers that go underneath and measured down from the top of my shoulders. Luckily, the length I had was exactly how much I needed. Then it was time to clean up all the edges before doing a hand-rolled hem. I folded the edges over by a few millimeters and went over that with my iron. For the hem, I used this fine silk thread in a matching color to my fabric. Then came the stitching. Hemming the long edges on either side of the fabric strip, a total of 12 yards, took me about a week to complete. Once that was done, I repeated the same steps for the short edges. Thankfully, those didn't take me a full week, but rather 1 hour. Alright, on to fixing the placement of the tabbards onto the tunic. To do that, I first needed a slim twill tape in a matching grey color. Since I always have white twill tape in various widths on hand, I chose to just dye that the desired color. I filled my smallest dye pot with just enough water so the tape would be able to move freely. Since both the tabard fabric and the twill tape were natural fibers, I was able to use the same dye for both of them, giving me a good chance that the colors would end up matching. And this was essentially the same thing I did when I was dyeing my tabard fabric, only on a much larger scale obviously. After a minute or two in the dye bath, I removed the tape, rinsed it with cold water and left it to dry. The dye gods must have smiled down on me because look at that color match. Now, time for some draping. After playing around with how the tabard should lie on the shoulders, I secured the pleats with a few blind stitches. Then I sewed a length of the dyed tape to the wrong side of the fabric where the shoulder seams of the tunic would be, making sure to keep my stitches invisible from the right side. After sewing on some small snap buttons onto the tape and their matching counterparts onto the shoulder seam of the tunic, the tabbards could now be snapped into place without me having to worry that they would slide off while fighting off some pesky Praetorian guards later on. Similarly, I draped and pleated the tabbards how I wanted them to sit at the waist, stitched the pleats and added twill tape and snaps. This would later be covered by the obi. And with that, the tabbards were done. For the obi, I chose this charcoal linen. When compared to the colors of tunic and tabbards, the linen was a tad too light in color, so I decided to give it a soak in grey dye. Same procedure as with the tabbards and twill tape, although I used my biggest pot this time so the whole yardage would be able to move around freely. I filled the pot with water, added the dye and turned on the heat. While I waited for the water to boil, I pre-wet the fabric in a separate container, as I found that this helps it take the dye better and more evenly. Once the dye bath was boiling, I added the fabric and let it soak in there for about 10 minutes, stirring everything every so often. Then I took the fabric out, rinsed it with a bit of cold water and hung it up to dry. The color turned out just perfect. Now on to cutting out the pattern pieces. The main piece was cut on the bias of the fabric, while the base and interlining were cut on the straight. After that, I serged the base and one side edge of the main piece. This side edge was folded over and pinned along the notched line on the interlining. Then, the main piece was pinned along the outer edges of the interlining, carefully matching all notches. To secure the two pieces together, I serged around all edges. Then I blind stitched the one short edge I had pinned in place earlier with some charcoal grey silk thread. Next, I pleated the excess volume of the oblong front panel down to match the width of the obi base, pinned and pressed everything in place. After that was done, I pinned the base and interlining pieces together at the top edge and sewed across. Then, the seam allowances were stitched down onto the interlining layer. I then pinned the short edges together and sewed them closed, leaving only the bottom edge open. After turning the obi inside out, I gave everything a good press. Pinning the open edges of base and front pieces together, I whip stitched that closed. For the last step, I added some snap buttons to the center back closure, and then Ray's obi was done. Moving on to the leather components of this cosplay, namely the belt, holster and wrist cuff. For all of these pieces I used a vegetable tanned leather, which I was going to dye later. I traced the patterns onto the back of the hide, making sure to transfer all the markings where the slits would be cut or where there was a fold. Then I cut the pieces out one by one. Next, I beveled all edges slightly to smooth them out. The holster pieces had to be skived at the edges to reduce the thickness when having to stitch through all the layers later on. After all the slits had been cut as well, the pieces were ready to be dyed. For the belt and holster, I used a water-based dark brown dye that gave the leather a nice antique finish. The edges were treated with a dark brown edge coat. The larger piece of the wrist cuff was stained a darker shade of brown compared to the belt, while the smaller part became a medium tan. Alright, let's finish up the belt first. After the dye had plenty of time to dry, it was time to add the twine. For this I used a natural colored jute cord, as I felt like it came pretty close in color and texture to what was used for Rey's belt in the movie. I cut a length of cord, wrapped it around the corresponding sections and tied it off. Then it was time to add the hardware. I slipped metal sliders onto the belt ends and glued them down. For the decorative stitching, I punched holes through the leather with my awl and stitched through the holes with a brown specialty thread for sewing leather. With the belt completed, I moved on to the holster. I glued the two pieces on top of each other, wrong sides together. After the glue was cured and completely dry, I marked the stitching holes. In hindsight, I should have done this before I dyed the holster, since I ended up having to re-dye those sections. Then I stitched through the holes with the same thread I used for the decorative stitching on the belt, working my way all around the edges. For the thigh strap, I slid some smaller slider buckles onto one end and, just like with the belt, glued them down and added decorative stitching. To make the next step a bit easier, I wet the leather with some water and molded it into shape. After it was dry again and kept the intended shape, it was time to punch holes for the screw posts. Then I added the posts, those forming the loop that would allow the holster to slide onto the belt, and those that would connect the thigh strap to the holster. After connecting the bottom strap piece to the main holster piece, I folded the side flaps on top of each other and glued them in place. Lastly, I added a button stud to the thigh strap to keep the end in place and punched some holes to make it adjustable. I treated the exposed edges of the holes with some edge coat. With the holster done as well, that only left the wrist cuff. Finishing this was very straightforward. I simply connected the bigger and smaller sections by sewing them together with a zigzag stitch. After a bit of wet molding to help it keep its shape, it was finished. I bought a pair of the Boots crepe bandages, the ones that were used in the movie. The only thing I needed to do before they were ready was to weather the edges. I used some charcoal character powder, which I dabbed onto the bandages with a tissue to achieve the desired effect. And just like that, they looked wonderfully aged and worn. As with all of my Rey cosplays so far, I was able to use my own hair for this look. I simply pulled my hair back at the crown and tied it back with some hair elastics. And with that, I've got another Rey cosplay in the books. I'm really glad I waited until I had built up my skills to tackle this project. The wait has definitely paid off, as I'm so thrilled and pleased with how this all came together. I've already compiled most of the materials for Rey's hero outfit from The Rise of Skywalker, and my Resistance Rey cosplay is technically still not finished, and I've also got some more Padme cosplays in the early planning stages. So, if you're interested in seeing me make more Star Wars cosplays in the future, among others, feel free to hit that subscribe button and give me a follow on Instagram to be up to date with my progress on those and other projects. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.